Red Butte Pass, Wyoming Territory, 1879. The wind swept dry across the valley, whispering through the brittle grass like it was warning the land itself. Clint Mercer stood by the corral fence, one boot propped on the lowest rail, arms resting, watching his Appaloosa mare nudge or fold toward water. He didn't speak, not to the horses, not to himself. Just stood there like a carving of the land, dust-worn, quiet, unmoved. People in Dry Fork called him Church Mouse. Not because he was holy, but because he was quiet, small in presence, and impossible to pin down. He rarely came to town, and when he did, it was on Sundays, quiet footsteps into the church, hat in hand, eyes down. Then he'd ride out before the last amen had echoed off the rafters. His place sat low in the gulch near Red Butte Pass, a modest ranch with just enough pasture to raise 5 or 6 good horses. The kind cavalry officers dreamed about and outlaws stole. Clint bred them without fanfare, sold them when he needed, and buried his gold under a cottonwood tree where no one knew. His only companion was silence. Some said it was grief that kept him so quiet. Others said it was guilt. But most just left him be. Dry Fork, however, was no longer a town where silence could keep him unsafe. The vultures had come. They weren't the biggest gang the West had seen, but they were smart, 10 men in black dusters who never rode the same trail twice, never left a witness breathing, never let a sheriff live long enough to speak. They hit ranches at night, burned barns, stole horses, and left families weeping at dawn. Folks said they weren't after cattle or coin. They were after fear. The sheriff of Dry Fork was 73 and half-blind. His deputy had just started shaving last winter. Nobody believed the law could hold back the vultures. Folks were selling off their land or hiding behind bolted doors. Clint did neither. He came to town one Sunday, as usual, tying his Appaloosa near the feed store. The townsfolk whispered when he passed. Not out of spite, but out of confusion. Why wasn't he afraid? Didn't he know what the gang was doing? Delaney Winters watched him from the porch of her store. She was a widow, same as Clint was a widower. Strong eyes, cracked hands, voice like willow bark, soft and bitter. When Clint stepped up to the counter with a sack of oats and a jar of liniment, she didn't waste time. "They're watching your land, Clint," she said quietly. "They know about your horses. The one's worth more than gold." He didn't look at her. Just pulled out a coin, set it on the wood, and said, "Ain't worth dying for." She leaned closer, dropped her voice to a whisper. "You ever shot a man, Clint Mercer?" He looked up then, just for a second, and his eyes, still, blue, and cold as a mountain lake, answered the question without a word. He turned and left. By sundown, a storm had gathered over the butte, but no rain came. Only lightning in the distance, twitching like some nervous god. That night, as the moon rose bone-white and full, a drifter staggered into Dry Fork. He was ragged, one boot missing, shirt soaked with blood, eyes wide as if he'd seen ghosts. He collapsed just outside the saloon, gasping for breath. Someone shouted for the doctor, but the men clutched the shirt of the deputy with trembling hands and rasped out 5 words. "They're comin'," for the quiet men near the butte. Then he passed out. The deputy ran straight to the sheriff, who only shook his head and muttered something about it being too late. The wind picked up that night. At the edge of the valley, Clint Mercer sat in his barn, sharpening a rusted horseshoe for no reason at all. He wasn't blind to the signs. His mare had been restless. Coyotes had stopped howling. Even the wind felt different, like it was holding its breath. When he heard the distant hooves, he didn't move. 6 of them. Riders in black hats, their horses breathing steam into the cold night. They dismounted without a word, fanning out around the yard. One carried a rope. Another held a torch. There were no badges, no names spoken. Just eyes full of hunger and hands ready for violence. Clint stood in the doorway of the barn, hands relaxed by his side, empty. The man with the torch stepped forward. "You Mercer?" Clint nodded once. "We're taking your horses. And your land. You don't scream, maybe you'll die faster." Clint didn't blink. "Ain't worth dying for," he said again. The torchbearer smiled. "That ain't your choice." They grabbed him, rough hands shoving him to the ground. He didn't fight. Didn't even flinch. They bound his hands, pulled him to his feet, and shoved him toward the slope that led toward the canyon. No one in Dry Fork knew what happened that night. They only heard the thunder without rain, the cries that echoed once, then vanished. And the next morning, when the sun lit the pass in red gold, something was different. Two of the vultures didn't ride back. The others, no one saw them return. Not through the canyon, not down the trail. But one man, an old trapper who lived by the ridge, said he saw 6 men ride in and only 4 ride out. He swore on his dead brother's grave that something moved through the canyon mist, quick and quiet, like a whisper with teeth. And somewhere, just past the rocks, he claimed he saw a figure kneeling in the dirt, head down, like he was praying over something. But when the trapper blinked, the figure was gone. Only a single boot print remained, pointing uphill. They came like wolves in the dark, silent, swift, and merciless. Clint Mercer didn't scream when they yanked him from his bedroll. The smell of smoke clung to his nostrils, his barn already ablaze, crackling like a funeral pyre in the distance. Sparks lit the sky behind them as they dragged him across the cold earth, ropes biting his wrists, boots scuffing across rock and gravel. His horses screamed somewhere in the night, wild and panicked, and the last thing he saw of his home was the roof caving in with a sigh of burning timber. No one said a word until they reached the ridgeline. Above them, the moon hung like a cold coin. They crested a rise dotted with scrub pine and came to a clearing with a lone juniper tree, twisted, black, and reaching out like it knew what was coming. Cass Morgan dismounted first. His boots hit the dirt with purpose, long coat fluttering like the wings of a crow. He took his time, brushing ash from his shoulder, then walked up to Clint, who knelt in the dust with hands bound and face unreadable. Cass crouched in front of him, eyes glinting with firelight. "Heard you never even draw your gun, Mercer," he said with a smirk. "Let's see how quiet you die." Clint didn't answer. Billy Knox shifted in the saddle. Youngest of the vultures, face still soft beneath the grime. He pulled his bandana down to speak, voice uncertain. "This don't feel right," Billy muttered. "He didn't fight us. He just walked out and handed the rope." Cass turned his head slowly. "You grow a conscience, Billy." Billy looked away. "Just saying. Man who don't scream when his home burns, either he's crazy or he's got something to hide." Cass chuckled and rose. "Don't worry. We'll find out which." The rope went over the branch. Clint stood when they pulled him upright, legs steady despite the blood dripping from his brow. His shirt was torn, his face calm. He looked at the branch above him, then at the men surrounding him, and only then did he speak. Voice like dusk over the plains. "If you're gonna hang a man," he said, "best pray he's truly dead." Cass laughed, slapped the flank of the horse, and stepped back. The world slowed. Clint dropped. Then, crack, the branch split in two with a sharp groan. The noose yanked taut, then slackened as Clint hit the ground with a thud, breath knocked from his chest but alive. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then everything erupted. One rider panicked, yanking his rifle. Another shouted, "He's running," even though Clint hadn't moved. Billy raised his revolver but didn't shoot. A flash, one shot. No one knew who fired first. Clint rolled, dirt in his mouth, head spinning. He bolted toward the rocks as gunfire tore through the night behind him. Bullets hit tree trunks. A rider cried out and fell from his saddle. Chaos twisted like a snake through the clearing. By the time Cass shouted for order, Clint was gone, swallowed by the black jaws of the canyon beyond. The riders cursed, spread out, searching the brush. But the shadows were deep, and the rocks swallowed sound. They found only silence. And blood. Cass stared at the broken branch. It had split right down the middle, the frayed rope dangling like a failed sentence. His jaw clenched. He looked toward the canyon, where even the moon refused to shine. "Find him," he growled. "Or don't bother coming back." They searched until dawn. No trail. No footprints. Nothing but fear. The sun rose blood orange over the valley, bleeding light across the butte. It was Billy Knox who found the first body, half buried under a tangle of rocks, eyes wide, mouth frozen mid-scream. Shot clean through the heart. He whistled and called the others. They gathered, muttering curses, guns out, eyes on the shadows. The second corpse was worse. A man named Tully, older, mean, carried a skinning knife in his boot and liked to carve his initials into fence posts. He'd been shot through the eye. One shot. Dead before he fell. No sign of who did it. But there was something else. Just beyond the body, in the soft dust between two stones, was a single boot print. Not the kind left in panic. Not stomped down in a rush. A careful, deliberate step, heel deep, toe light, pointing uphill. Cass stared at it for a long time. Then he looked around at the ridgeline, wind steering his coat. His men were quiet now. Even the birds had stopped singing. "He ain't just running," Billy said, voice dry. Cass didn't answer. "He's hunting," Billy whispered. "He's picking us off." Cass finally turned. "He's one man." Billy shook his head. "Not anymore." No one said it, but they all felt the truth sliding in under their skin like a cold blade. Whatever Clint Mercer had been before, the quiet rancher, the widower who bred horses and whispered to the ground, that man was gone. What had risen from the canyon wasn't soft, wasn't tame. It was something else entirely. And it wasn't done yet. Smoke still rose in thin gray ribbons from the blackened ribs of the house when Clint Mercer came back at dawn. The ground crunched beneath his boots, ash mixing with frost. The barn was nothing but charred beams leaning against each other like broken crosses, and the corral sat empty. No neigh, no stomp of hoofs. Just silence. He stood for a long while, staring at the ruins, face set like stone. The smell of fire clung to his clothes, but his eyes were dry. Grief had long ago burned out of him, replaced by something colder. Slowly, he walked past the wreckage, past the graves marked with crude wooden crosses, one of them leaning, the letters "Roof Mercer" nearly faded by rain. He stopped at an old oak, roots twisting deep into the earth. His knees creaked as he knelt, pushing away the earth with bare hands until his fingers scraped oilskin. The bundle came up heavy, wrapped tight and stiff with age. He sat back on his heels, breath fogging in the morning air, and unrolled the cover. Inside lay a Colt Dragoon revolver. Long barrel, steel dulled with time, ivory grip worn smooth by a familiar hand. 5 small notches carved deep along its frame. Each mark meant something no man dared say aloud. Clint brushed the weapon with his thumb as if greeting an old companion, and the world shifted. He remembered the war, fog over the Potomac, the rattle of musket fire, the cries of men who never saw him coming. Back then, they called him Whispershot. Not because he spoke, but because his pistol never thundered. It whispered death. Men dropped where they stood, silent holes drilled neat and true. Squads of gray and blue alike had learned to fear the hush before his shot. But Ruth, she had hated that name. He saw her smile again, the way her hand smelled of flower when she touched his face. He remembered the night she'd begged him to bury the Colt, to bury the life that came with it. He had done as she asked, swearing never to raise it again. Then the bullet came, a bounty hunter's wild shot meant for another man, that tore her from him in the dust of Dry Fork Street. The Dragoon stayed buried. Clint had laid her in the ground and laid his gun with her in spirit. He became the quiet man no one feared. Until now. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the crunch of hooves. Clint didn't move when a young rider approached, hat crooked, badge dull on his vest. Deputy Eli Parker slid from his horse, eyes wide at the sight of the ruin. "Mercer," Eli breathed, stepping cautiously, as if afraid to disturb ghosts. "I came as soon as I heard." "God Almighty." His gaze swept the wreckage, then fell to the revolver resting in Clint's hands. Eli's throat tightened. "That's yours." Clint looked up, eyes blue and still. It was. "You can't face them alone," Eli pressed, voice trembling between duty and fear. "Cass Morgan's men don't leave survivors. They'll be back." Clint holstered the Colt at his side, the weight settling like it had never left. He stood, taller now, shadow cutting across the ashes. "You want to help?" His voice was low, steady as earth. "Don't follow me." Eli opened his mouth to protest, but something in Clint's gaze stopped him cold. It wasn't anger. It wasn't despair. It was inevitability. Eli lowered his head and stepped back. That evening, across the valley, Cass Morgan sat by a fire that cast sharp shadows on his scarred face. His men whispered nervously, eyes darting toward the darkness. 2 of theirs hadn't returned. Cass held Tully's black hat in his hands, turning it over slowly, the bullet hole neat through the crown. He lifted his head, sneer twisting his lips. "He's not quiet," he said, voice carrying over the crackle of flames. "He's a ghost with a gun." Billy Knox shifted uncomfortably. He was supposed to be nothing. Just a rancher. Cass leaned forward, eyes burning, then explained 2 dead men, each with a bullet clean enough for a surgeon to admire. "Mercer ain't no rancher. He's something else." Silence draped heavy over the camp. The men looked at each other, their bravado crumbling. Fear had begun to eat at their marrow. Cass slammed the hat to the ground. "I want his head." I want it on that oak tree by his burned house, so the whole valley knows what happens when you cross the vultures." The fire spat sparks like angry stars. Back at the ranch, night drew its cloak tight. Clint sat on the porch steps of what little remained, the dragoon resting across his lap. His eyes were far away, fixed on the line of the butte against the sky. The wind carried only silence. Then came the sound, a soft clatter of hooves in the dark. He rose, hand falling to his gun, eyes narrowing. Out of the night staggered one of his Appaloosas, sides lathered with sweat, flanks streaked with dust. The mare limped, trembling, blood oozing from a graze along her neck. Clint's breath caught when he saw the brand seared into her hide. A black V, still raw and ugly. The horse whinnied weakly, pressing her head against his chest like a child seeking comfort. Clint stroked her mane, his face hard as granite. The vultures hadn't just stolen. They had marked. They had claimed. He looked down at the colt, the ivory grip pale in the moonlight. His jaw clenched. The quietman was gone, and in his place rose the shadow of Whisper Shot Mercer. And somewhere in the night, Cass Morgan's men laughed around their fire, unaware that death was already walking toward them, silent as dawn. The lantern light in Delaney Winter's kitchen flickered against the log walls, casting shadows that clung to the corners like secrets. Clint Mercer sat at her table, shirt stripped to the waist, skin laced with cuts and bruises from his flight through the canyon. He didn't wince when she dabbed the cloth against his side, though his jaw tightened with each press. Silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle of the stove and Delaney's steady breath. When she reached for more bandages, her hand brushed against the holster lying on the chair. The revolver's ivory grip gleamed pale in the firelight. Her fingers froze. She whispered, almost to herself, "So it's true. You were the one from Devil's Gulch." Clint lifted his eyes, blue and unyielding. He gave a single nod. "They never saw me," he said quietly. "Only the flash." Delaney drew in a slow breath. Every tale she'd heard, the soldiers whispering about a phantom marksman, the campfire stories of men falling without warning, suddenly fit into the men who sat before her, calm as stone, carrying scars that no eye could see. She tied the bandage firm, her hands trembling though she tried to steady them. "And now they've dragged you back to it." Clint's gaze dropped to the revolver. "I swore I'd buried it with Ruth." Delaney laid a hand over his arm, soft but unyielding. "Some things can't stay buried." Outside, the night pressed close. Somewhere down the valley, a coyote howled, long and lonely. Word of Clint's return to the gun spread like wildfire. Dry Fork changed overnight. Men avoided his eyes. Women pulled their children close when he walked by. The vultures began to circle the town like vultures true, sniffing out anyone who dared speak kindly of him. The first body appeared at dawn, hanging from the water tower rope, boots swaying in the wind. A note pinned to his chest read, "Keep quiet, or join him." A week later, a ranch hand who had once tipped his hat to Clint vanished on the road to Red Butte. His horse returned riderless, saddle stained with something dark. Fear spread thicker than smoke. People crossed the street to avoid each other. Doors bolted before sundown. Even the church pews stood half empty. Clint had become more than a man. He was a storm that drew lightning toward anyone nearby. One evening, as Delaney swept the dust from her porch, Clint approached with the weight of shadows on his shoulders. He stopped at her gate, words heavy on his tongue. "You should leave," he said, voice low but firm. "They'll come for you next." Delaney straightened, her eyes meeting his. "You think I'm afraid of them?" "You should be." She shook her head. "Clint Mercer, you pulled me out of the river the day Grieve near drowned me. After my husband died, I wasn't living. Just breathing. Nobody saw me. Nobody cared. But you did. And I won't run now, not when you're the one they're hunting." For the first time in years, something flickered in Clint's eyes, something softer than steel. He looked away, unable to hold her gaze. "Then you stay on your own terms, Delaney. But don't mistake me for a man worth saving." The days that followed were restless. Clint no longer moved like a rancher but like a predator. He walked his land as though it were a battlefield. He set snares in the gullies, strung wires across narrow passes, and placed sharpened stakes where hooves might fall. He moved silently, his shadow blending with the rocks, his revolver always within reach. Delaney watched from a distance, torn between fear and awe. The quiet man who once tipped his hat at Sunday service had become something otherworldly, as though the land itself had shaped him into its weapon. The vultures tested his borders. Twice, Riders crept near his ranch at night. Twice, they vanished into the dark with no trace but the distant crack of a gunshot. Rumor spread that Mercer didn't fight like a man. He hunted like a wolf. One night, a scream shattered the stillness of the valley. It echoed against the cliffs, high and desperate, then broke into sobs before fading into silence. By morning, one of the vultures was missing from Cass Morgan's camp. His horse returned alone, riderless, reins dragging in the dust. The rest of the gang shifted uneasily. Some muttered that Mercer was the devil himself, risen from the ashes. Others spat curses but avoided Cass's eyes. That evening, Cass sat at his campfire, chewing on a strip of jerky, eyes narrowed into slits. The firelight carved lines into his face, making him look older, meaner. He hated silence. It reminded him of Mercer. A sound interrupted the night. Hooves on dirt, the soft thump of something dropped near the fire. The men turned. A wooden box sat just beyond the glow, lid nailed shut. Cass rose slowly, boots grinding gravel, and kicked it closer. He crouched, pried it open with his knife. Inside lay the missing rider's black hat. A bullet was lodged clean through the crown. Cass stared, face hardening. Around him, his men shifted, muttering curses under their breath, but none dared speak too loud. Billy Knox swallowed hard. "He's playing with us, Cass." Cass's eyes burned like coals. He lifted the hat, studied the hole, then tossed it into the fire where it caught quick and bright. The flames devoured it, sparks rising into the night. He turned slowly, gaze sweeping across the circle of frightened faces. "Playtime ends now," he said. His voice was low, dangerous, and Everman felt the weight of it. But even as the fire crackled, even as Cass's fury grew, a chill settled over the camp. Because somewhere beyond the glow of their flames, the wolves were already circling. And Clint Mercer, quiet, relentless, and reborn as Whispershot, was leading the hunt. Dawn broke red across the valley. The sky burning like the earth already knew blood was coming. Smoke from the night's embers curled up from the ruins of Clint Mercer's ranch, black fingers reaching toward the pale light. The land was still, silent but for the wind through broken beams. And then came the thunder of hooves. The vultures rode in hard, 10 strong, black coats flaring, rifles ready. They fanned out in a circle, dust rising around them like a storm. Cass Morgan sat tall in the saddle, his scarred face twisted in grim satisfaction. He raised a hand, and the riders spread wider, surrounding the ruins. "End of the line, Mercer," Cass growled, voice carrying in the morning air. "Ain't no place left to run." From the broken porch, the boards creaked. Clint stepped into the open, coattails flapping like dark wings in the wind. His face was cut and bruised, but his eyes burned clear, blue as winter. He didn't draw yet. He just stood there, steady and calm, as if he'd been waiting for this moment his whole life. "You wanted me, Cass." His voice cut through the dust. "You're gonna get me." Before the riders could laugh, the crack of a rifle split the morning. One vulture toppled from his horse, blood spraying the dust. On the ridge above, Deputy Eli Parker stood, rifle smoking, jaw clenched tight with a courage he didn't know he had. From the shadows of the ruined house, another figure emerged, Delaney Winters, skirts swaying, shotgun braced in trembling hands. Her eyes darted, fear battling resolve, but she held her ground. The vultures cursed, startled. They thought Clint was alone. Now there were 3. Cass snarled, "Kill 'em all." Gunfire erupted like thunder rolling down the canyon. Smoke filled the yard, bullets ripping through boards, dirt exploding at Clint's boots. But he moved with the stillness of a predator, revolver rising, muzzle flashing. One shot dropped a rider clean through the chest. Another spun and fell before his finger had even left the trigger. Every bullet told a story. One for the man who'd burned his barn. One for the hand who carved the brand into his horse. One for the rider who laughed as Ruth's name was spat in the dust years ago. Whispershot Mercer had returned, and his silence was deadlier than any shout. Traps snapped shut, hidden wires yanking men from saddles, pits swallowing horses whole. Screams rose, muffled quick by gunfire. Eli fired steady from above, each shot echoing his determination. Delaney's shotgun roared, smoke bursting from the barrel, her small frame jarring with every pull but never faltering. Clint advanced through the chaos, revolver steady, coat whipping. His face never changed. Calm, cold, final. The vultures began to fall back, fear cracking their bravado. Men who had laughed over whiskey the night before now screamed like cattle at slaughter. Cass fought through the panic, barking orders, firing wildly. A bullet clipped Clint's shoulder, spinning him half around. He staggered but didn't fall, turning back with eyes that burned hotter than the wound. He fired once more, clean, precise, and another rider crumpled into the dust. By the time the smoke began to clear, only 3 of the vultures remained upright. 2 bolted, spearing their horses into the hills. Cass stayed, teeth gritted, blood on his sleeve. He fired once at Eli, missed, then spurred his horse toward the canyon. Clint watched him go, chest heaving. The dragoon hung heavy in his hand, chamber empty. He let it fall to his side and started after him. The chase cut through the canyon, hooves striking sparks on stone. Cass rode hard, clutching his bleeding arm, fear carving lines into his face. Behind him, Clint moved silent as a shadow, his horse breathing fire, eyes fixed on his quarry. Cass dismounted in a rocky gulch, stumbling toward higher ground. He turned, pistol clicking on an empty chamber. No bullets left. His lips peeled back in desperation. He drew his knife instead, blade flashing in the half-light. Clint stepped into the gulch, dragoon empty, holstered. He pulled a knife from his belt, steel catching the dawn. The 2 men circled, breath steaming, the canyon walls closing them in like a grave. Cass lunged, knife slashing. Clint sidestepped, the blade grazing his coat. They grappled, boots scraping on stone, knives flashing in quick arcs. Cass was brutal, wild, swinging with fury. Clint was precise, patient, every movement measured, the predator letting the prey wear itself thin. Cass managed to drive Clint against a boulder, knife raised high. "This ends with you, Mercer," he roared, spittle flying. Clint caught his wrist, strength surging from somewhere deeper than bone. He shoved the blade aside, teeth bared, voice cutting low. "You tried to hang a quiet man." He slammed Cass against the rock, forcing the knife back toward him. Their faces were inches apart, Cass's eyes wide with rage and fear. Clint drove a blade home, deep into Cass's chest. Cass gasped, body jerking, eyes going wide as the strength left him. "But I was death," Clint whispered, twisting the knife, waiting for a reason. Cass's mouth worked, no sound escaping. His eyes glazed, locked on Clint's, and then he sagged against the rock, dead, eyes open to the dawn. Clint held him a moment longer, breathing hard, before letting the body slump to the ground. He stood there, chest heaving, blood on his hands, dust in his hair. The canyon was silent but for the whisper of wind. Slowly, Clint pulled the dragoon from his holster. He looked at it, long and cold, the ivory grip shining pale against his scarred hand. The weight of every life it had taken pressed heavy against him. Without a word, he turned and hurled it into the canyon below. The steel spun once, twice, then vanished into the shadows, clattering against stone before silence swallowed it whole. The dawn spread brighter across the land, painting the cliffs gold, but Clint Mercer stood in shadow, covered in blood and dust, amid both redeemed and damned. Weeks slipped by, and with them the ashes of Dry Fork began to fade beneath new timber and fresh nails. Men who once whispered behind locked doors now swung hammers in the open, roofs rose where ruin had been, and laughter, hesitant, but real, crept back into the streets. Life was stubborn on the frontier. It always found a way. Delaney Winters reopened her store, the shelves slowly filling with oats, flour, and cloth brought in from the rail towns. The bell above her door rang again, not just with trade but with the comfort of routine. Her eyes carried shadows, but when children ran past her porch, giggling with marbles and sticks, she let herself smile. Eli Parker wore a new badge now, brighter than the old one, its shine catching sunlight when he passed through town. The people called him sheriff with respect he hadn't known he deserved, though he carried the title humbly. He knew the badge hadn't been won by his rifle alone, but by the silence that had moved with deadly precision through fire and smoke. And that silence lived still, a mile outside town. Clint Mercer worked without fanfare. He rebuilt his house plank by plank, his hands calloused, his face set, never asking for help. The land still bore scars, the charred line where the barn had burned, the stump of the oak where a noose had once been tied, but Clint carried on as if the scars were part of him, as if they needed no covering. From the surviving Appaloosa mare came a foal, legs unsteady, eyes wide as the open sky. Clint watched her totter across the pasture, her coat dappled in sunlight, and something softened in his weathered face. He named her Ruth, his voice a whisper that trembled as it left him, the name carrying the weight of a promise reborn. The townsfolk spoke of that night like it was myth. Some swore Clint wasn't flesh and blood but a ghost risen from the ashes, a specter with eyes like lightning. Others said thunder itself had birthed him, that the storm had taken the shape of a man. None agreed, yet none doubted. The vultures were gone, buried in shallow graves, their leader dead with eyes open to the dawn. Only Clint Mercer had walked away, silent as ever. On Sundays, he returned to the church, not to sit among the pews. He never went that far, but to stand outside as the bell tolled, hat in his hands, listening to the echoes. One morning, as he leaned against the rail, a boy no older than 12 crept up the steps. Dust clung to his trousers, and courage fought with awe in his eyes. "Mister," the boy asked, voice hushed but steady, "were you really the deadliest shot?" Clint looked down, the corner of his mouth twitching into something that almost resembled a smile. He crouched so his eyes met the boy's, setting his hat low across his brow. "Only when I had to be," he said softly. The boy's eyes widened, and he nodded solemnly, as though he'd been entrusted with a truth too heavy for his small shoulders. Then he scampered off, carrying the legend with him like a torch to be passed along. Clint stood, slid the hat back on his head, and turned away. As the sun dipped low, he walked toward Red Butte Pass. His shadow stretched long over the gold-dusted earth, trailing him like a companion that refused to let go. Each step was slow, deliberate, as if he were walking deeper into the silence he had always carried. Delaney watched from her porch, the evening light brushing her face. She clutched the edge of her shawl, her heart heavy yet proud. She had seen him as a mun when others saw only a ghost. She had tended his wounds, heard the truth of his past, and still chosen to stand beside him. But she knew now, more than ever, that Clint Mercer did not belong to the town or even to her. He belonged to the silence, to the land, to the legend. Her lips moved with a whisper meant only for the wind. He never needed noise to be heard. The sun slid lower, the sky burning orange and crimson, and Clint's figure grew smaller against the butte. His steps never faltered, his coat steering in the breeze like wings. The dragoon he had once carried lay at the bottom of a canyon, but its shadow lingered in the memory of every man who had seen it flash. And though no one dared speak it aloud while he walked among them, all who had lived that night carried the same truth in their hearts. They tried to hang the quiet rancher, not knowing he was the deadliest shot alive,